all of these AI projects that have come up over the last several years, all of them follow the same exact pattern. It's a gigantic data project with a very thin layer of AI model use over the top of it. Like everything else is about information retrieval. It's about data modeling. It's about like pulling together my information in a way that this thing that's focused on language and like understanding semantic connections within language, how can it get me the answer that I want? You got to remember that these models don't know any of that stuff that you know. So you've got to find a way to take those things and give it that context.
I'm Derek Aranda, and this is Supply Change. Here, we go beyond AI hype to examine how to stand up intelligent supply chains in complex organizations. If you want a clear-eyed view of how to do this in the real world, this show is for you. Welcome to Supply Change. Today's episode is a bit of an audible. I had originally had this episode later on in the season, but there's really been so much happening over the past few months, as is true with AI, that I thought it was important to really kind of bring it forward. Two things really stuck out for me. One of those was with Claudebot, and that really was the emergence of agents and people really starting to get access and play with those in their daily lives in ways that they hadn't before. And tied to that, the second piece was really around the changing economics of AI consumption in organizations. We're starting to see the frontier LLMs, the Anthropics and OpenAIs changing the way that they're pricing. And both of those really started getting me thinking about how we're deploying agents inside of organizations. Really want to kind of step back and have a bit more of a conversation about what does that really mean when agents start getting into organizations. And so today I'm really thrilled to be joined by Traey Hatch from New Math Data, who's going to help us drive a bit of a conversation around this. So Traey, welcome to Supply Change. And before we dive in, love for you to introduce yourself and share a bit about how you've been involved on the journey with AI, really from the beginning, if you think about RPA to machine learning to Gen AI and now with Agentic AI.
Thanks, Derek. Yeah, glad to be here. Traey Hatch, CEO of New Math Data. We are a professional services firm that is primarily an AWS partner. Our team focuses on data and analytics. That has been our background. Before LLMs were released, we were doing a lot of data warehousing, building a data lakes, helping teams understand how machine learning might be applied to their data sets and analytics. And then with the release of ChatGPT, 3 years ago, we established a AI practice. And so since then, we've been doing a lot of work, at least over the last several years in the startup space, helping teams build AI features into their SaaS applications. Over the last, as you said, like 6 months, we've seen just a tremendous acceleration in all types of businesses now being interested in how they can build AI workflows, build AI into their applications and their business processes. And so we've been doing a ton of work. Almost all of our conversations have shifted there.
And I think that's exactly why I want to have you on the show, is because really it's that practical, hands-on exposure to how this is actually being deployed into enterprises and how they're using it. I mean, there's been a lot of hype, a lot of conversations. We're starting to hear a lot of the stats around the false starts, right? So, I think I saw something, it was a McKinsey that talked about 40-odd% of AI projects are not going to go from pilot into scale, right? So I think companies are starting to hit sort of that ceiling of, how do I take this from the idea? I think we're all sold sort of on the capability of the technology, but now how do I practically apply it? And I think that's a bit of what I'd love to sort of dive into in this conversation today. Where are you seeing sort of that interface of the technical deployment with now how that hits really the operational ongoings inside of the organization?
In addition to that McKinsey article, there's been that MIT article that has been making the rounds everywhere. That's 80% of businesses are not seeing ROI. I mean, I think it's wrong for us to think about it as failed projects. This is the experimental phase of what we're doing. Like, we are trying to figure out how this works. I think that you're seeing that businesses are, like you said, bought in to the capabilities of the technology, but there are things to learn about how it works. There's things to learn about how we work with the technology and the processes themselves. And there's also just other things to build that fill in, gaps in important capabilities. Governance is one. Understanding where is there overlap. We're seeing a proliferation of projects inside businesses that are overlapping and competing, and it not because there's any intention for them to compete. It's just this team goes off and builds something, this team goes off and builds something, and then they get back together and they're like, oh, this is highly overlapping. And so I think there's a lot to figure out for companies in that space. Like, how do we effectively use this technology? How are we not going to overlap in our capabilities between teams? And how do we make sure that this is a safe and well governed platform to use?
Right. No, I think those are all really important elements for us to dive into, right? And I think, when I started this podcast, my first episode is really looking at definitions, right? Because I think it's really important that we're sort of grounded in what are we actually talking about? And the reality, this is much more complicated, I think, than people recognized, partly because they didn't actually define it properly to begin with, right? And I think maybe using your expertise, I'd love to step back, not get into an overly technical conversation about this, but as you're engaging with enterprises, where are those sort of points of confusion that maybe are leading to those overlaps, that non-alignment that you're seeing with organizations, right? We say AI, but that could be Gen AI, so generative AI, the LLMs, right? So that's a chatbot type technology. That could be physical AI, right? You start to get into robotics, sensors, et cetera, right? Things that are autonomous trucking, that kind of activity. You get into agentic AI, which is now taking data in, making choices, and then executing a task. So people are saying AI, but that really can cover 3, 4, 5 different things, right? So is that a point of challenge that you run into in your conversations with organizations? And how do you help them think through, well, what am I really looking for?
I definitely think that the terminology has become, blanket. AI now covers what people used to call ML. It also covers what people were thinking about as process automation and workflow automation. It also covers some of the, like analytics data modeling that people would do. So I think all of those things have now been lumped under this term AI. So that is definitely a point of confusion, I think, for businesses. I think what they mean is, where am I going to apply this transformative technology that has come out of LLMs into my process? Because I think that this has given companies a renewed sense of motivation to go revisit things that were difficult with ML, with analytics, and with workflow automation. I don't know that companies are having difficulty identifying where they want to go apply it. I think, like all things, this is now new business process, and companies that are good at business process are going to be good at doing this type of work. Companies that are, have not been good at, how to roll out change, how to handle business process modification, like how to set up run books and, handle their operations in a pretty structured way. Those are companies that are going to have difficulty with AI. I tell like our people, and I tell customers all the time, like, this is like dealing with your coworker, right? Like these are probabilistic models. They don't do exactly the same thing. And oftentimes for you to get to the answer that you want from this process is a conversation, just like it would be with a business analyst, right? Like, let's take, for example, I want to get some analytics output from my SQL warehouse or from my data set that we've collected to do reporting. Well, if I'd done this through a business analyst, I go and I talk to that business analyst. I tell them what I want. They give me back something. I look at it and I go, no, this is not what I want. Here, I'm going to ask you to modify this. No, I want to look at this data a little bit differently. Oh, I think we have this other column, right? This other piece of information. It becomes a conversation. This is no different. Like, dealing with these models and these agents that are talking to these data sources is no different than that. And I think as long as you understand that and understand that it's a process to get there, that you're going to do okay. I think if you're expecting perfection from the first moment that you get these processes or technology in place, it's not going to work.
I think that's a message that's come through very clearly over a lot of the conversations that I have, right? This is a process journey, and you have to go step back, break down what it is you want to accomplish, and then work progressively through what are the elements you need to put together. I like the analogy you use about, the conversation with a business analyst. Yeah. Because I think that sometimes goes back a bit to, I think maybe the mindset that some people have when they're coming into AI, that AI is this one answer, right? That you put AI in. Forget the different flavors of AI, but you put AI in and you'll get the answer. But if I think about a business analyst, if I break that down, there are lots of different things that analyst would do, right? That analyst would have to go have a data set that they're interrogating. So you have to have access to the data. There are certain calculations that they're going to run that I always want it to be 1 + 1 is always 2, right? So there's that deterministic piece. And then there's going to be a piece where they're bringing an opinion or they're expanding sort of the solution space, right? So then that more creative, maybe that's should fall a bit more into the probabilistic space, right? So as you're helping folks think through how they're building sort of this agentic workflow or this stack, how do you help them think through, you know what, it's not just the LLM or, you know, the brain piece. You have all these other elements that you have to put around it for it to actually work.
I think that we are approaching it from the place of we want the solutions that we're designing or that we build we are trying to bring information to the user of that system that helps them feel confident about the answer. If you can look at what it's doing and you can understand, yes, this is the path I was going to take, or no, this is not the path I was going to take, but I understand why this thing did what it did. That helps people feel confident that they understand where the answer arrived, like they received, came from. I think that's critical context that people need. And I think if you just feel like you're going to approach this from the place of like, I'm just going to ask a question and I'm going to get the answer back and it's going to be the perfect right answer, you're not going to move your organization to a place where they're going to adopt these tools, because the people who use them are going to go, like, they'll use them until the first time they go present it to someone else and it's wrong. And then they're going to go, I'm never going to trust this thing again. But if they were able to see, where did it come from? What's the provenance of this answer? What's the process that you went through to arrive at this? It's the same thing that they would have done with their analyst coworker, right? And so I think that's critical information to build into these tools and process. Like, what was the process this took to give me this answer? And as long as you can present that, like, that is, I think, the first step into making people comfortable with the answers that came back.
I'll love to come back to that piece about trust and explainability, right? But help me break that down a bit more on sort of the technology side of this, right? So kind of what you just described around how you take that journey for what that analyst is doing. How do I translate that into my technology, right? What does that mean in terms of, you know, what is sort of that processing center that I need to have? What is that in terms of how that's pulling data? What's that in terms of how it's actually calculating, right? Because we always hear about hallucinations and, oh my gosh, I can't trust this to run the calcs for me because it's going to give me a different answer every time, right? So how do I think about that at a macro level in terms of what are those sort of building blocks I need to think about to make that process?
What we're seeing is that we need to give the agent and the user of the application information that helps them understand the provenance. Well, there are things that you can build into your applications or into your overall stack that help you get that information both into your context as well as get repeatable results. And I think this is now a big conversation, especially in the data, in the analytics world, right? Is we are building data stores, systems, knowledge graphs. Ontology has been a very hot topic over the last, even really just couple of weeks, that you use to make sure that you are allowing this like probabilistic model to arrive at the same answer to, you know, subtly different questions. If I ask a question one way and you ask a question another way, your language may be slightly different than my language, but we really probably want this, we may want the same thing. And if we have tools in place that the agents can use that will direct the answer to that question towards the thing that we really want, then that will help it be repeatable. And again, then you surface how you arrived at that answer, and then that helps with confidence, and it also helps with tuning, right? I I may need to make a slight adjustment because I'm asking the question. This is the way that someone else is always going to ask the question, but we're arriving at the wrong answer. Well, what do we need to change along the way to do that? And so I think this is the place where, I was saying earlier that this is like a process. A lot of these systems and like these tools either don't exist or they have existed for some other use, and they're now being co-opted by these processes to give you this context and to give you this like repeatable answer. And so we're seeing like a huge investment in not only the businesses who are using the final technology, but in startups who are addressing these gaps, open source projects that are trying to address these things. Like there's a huge investment in building the tools right now that is going to make the whole process work.
So a couple of questions on that one. So maybe before I get into that, is that what people talk about when they say the harness that they wrap around?
No, not necessarily. No. So the harness usually refers to like that is the thing that is going to orchestrate the work. So like Claude is a harness. So, you can think about any of these other like Copilot, VS Code, I guess in that case would be kind of the harness, or Hero, which is AWS's Agentic AI IDE. That's a harness. Cursor is a harness. So what that really means is like, I'm going to wrap the model API calls in this orchestration layer that helps me do that. Now, what we're talking about is really the thing that you can use to go gather additional context. So for example, like if you're operating in a repo, in a Git repo, if I'm looking at code, I'm going to, my model is going to have a tool that goes and like searches my repo that gives me back context about the code that I'm working on. We're talking about now, how do I give my model the ability to search my enterprise context? Like, who do I work with? Who are their managers? Who's responsible for what systems? Like all of those kinds of things become part of the thing that you need to then pull into that context. And I think about that less as like the harness and more as just data that I need to give to the model for that context. Like we've been telling people consistently that all of these AI projects that have come up over the last several years, all of them are follow the same exact pattern. It's a gigantic data project with a very thin layer of AI model use over the top of it. Like everything else is about information retrieval. It's about data modeling. It's about like pulling together my information in a way that this thing that's focused on language and like understanding semantic connections within language, how can it get me the answer that I want? And the way to do that is structure the information that it gets.
That's a place where I think a lot of people, they start struggling, right? So listening to you, I think I got what you're explaining. I think that's where a lot of folks start struggling, is thinking about, well, what does that really mean from a practical application perspective, right? So if I supply chain is the big topic that we're anchored on here for this conversation. But what I'm hearing you talk about, right, that is, if I am looking at renewing a contract that I have with a supplier, that's about where am I going to pull the data on, financials? Well, what are the other contracts out there that I might have? What are the terms that I need to put into that contract? What's the historical performance that supplier has had? That might be a different data set, right? How, what can they actually do for me? What lanes, if this is a transportation supplier, where can they go? Can they get to Dallas? Can they get to Phoenix from Houston, right? So it's now, how do I pull all that information in? And you're right, going back to that business analyst, I think that's where, how do you break down really what the process is for that activity that let's say a contract analyst is doing? A lot of it is actually pulling the information in, and then at that point thinking about, now how then do I make decisions against that information?
Yeah,
right?
and it's even like one step above that. So for example, you worked in supply chain. What's an example of the name of a system you would go with, like
SAP, right? So a lot of BI reports that we'd pull out of SAP.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So you would say this is an SAP, right? And SAP is a highly configurable system that has no one consistent way that it's deployed within enterprises, right? It's a very, very customizable system for enterprise resource planning. If you say SAP and another customer says this is an SAP, the data may be vastly different, right? And the context around that data may be very different. But when you say it to one of your coworkers, they know exactly what you meant by that, because they have worked with this data in this format with this system for a while. You got to remember that these models don't know any of that stuff that you know. So you've got to find a way to take those things and give it that context. Like you said, the word lanes in your supply chain example. To me, that's like traffic lanes on a street, right?
Right.
But what I believe you mean is that like these are the routes.
The routes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's a word that needs a definition for the model. And so what we have been relying on up till now, until recently, is the general knowledge of the models that have been trained into those through the, like, basically, all these companies, Anthropic and OpenAI, and, all of them are basically going to the web. They're scraping a whole bunch of data, and then they're pulling that in and training their model on it. And so what you're relying on is this way that we are conversing about this subject somewhere out in the web the way that I expect to be talking about it? And the answer is maybe it is, but maybe the way that we speak about it specifically in our organization is a little bit different. And so you may not want to adopt the general discussion of it. You may want to adopt your specific way that you talk about it. And the models need some way to understand, this is the way we talk about this subject. Here's where our data is located. Here's where I go find the answer to this question. And all of that can be very tribal. It can be very specific to an organization. And so we're seeing people spend time and money in now building those tools for models so they can then go find that context for their specific enterprise. And in fact, you were saying, before we started, we were joking about Terminator and Skynet. There's a book that I continue to go back to, which is Neuromancer by William Gibson. And one of the things in there is corporate ontologies. It's interesting. This book was written in 1984, and it's about AI. One of the things he talks about in there is that these companies, these like corporations, have amassed these ontologies about their operations. And this is the store of knowledge that is an important thing to their organization. And I think that's what we're going to find out is true with these models, is that if we want agents and models to operate on our systems, we need to give them some place to understand how we run our operations.
And I have to imagine that's probably where a lot of the challenge probably comes from, right? Because to your point, we make all these assumptions that you understood what I meant by lane. Surely you know what that means, right? And so even within organizations, all these assumptions, these semantics that we use that we don't even necessarily appreciate, that's probably got to be where, when now they bring in these agents, well, why doesn't the agent understand? Is that where you find a significant amount of that now step back work needs to be done to actually, okay, now let's dive in and not actually understand what we mean by lane?
Not only do what we mean, but where is the information located? Like a generally trained model is not going to understand what the URL is for SAP in your organization, right? It needs to be told that. It has to have some way to go look up, oh, you mean SAP? There's an API for this. I can pull data from this in this location. Maybe we've exported that data to a warehouse somewhere. I need to be told where that is, just like you would when you're onboarding an employee, right?
I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah. I need to be told, like, how do I get into this system? Do I have credentials? Do I have permission to get to the data inside? Do I have the role I need inside that application? Like, all those things have to be given to these things and these applications, these processes. And we're right in the middle of figuring out how that works.
And I think maybe a lot of folks have probably been lulled into a sense of complacency because we've all used the chat GPTs and Claudes of the world, but more often than not for general knowledge type stuff, which is probably where they really excel. But now when you want to take that and you want to bring it into something that's much more specific to my business or my operations, it doesn't work quite as well. And so then we think, well, I got to throw, this is just not going to work for me. But I guess what I'm hearing is it really is a lot more than about, you really now have to think about how do you onboard that solution into your space. So maybe if we can, so do I want to onboard a Claude or a Chat GPT or a Deep or I hear about those smaller, simpler LLM solutions that you can layer on top, maybe open source LLMs. How do we think about when and how do you decide? Am I on a frontier model? Am I on a specialist model? Am I on an open source model?
The answer is it depends. There's tooling out there now that will make decisions about what types. So for example, you brought up the concept of harness. Many of these harnesses now have like an auto mode, right? I'm going to route the work that I'm being asked to produce to the right model for that particular use case. That can be done with the model itself. I'm going to ask a high performing model, a large model, an expensive model to understand my question and then make a choice about where's the right place to do that. And most of the time for things like coding exercises or like co-work things where I'm going to produce an Excel document or I'm going to produce a PowerPoint slide, that sort of routing of your question to the right model underneath that sort of like auto idea works really well. The other thing is I'm going to purpose build something with a specific model in mind because I know it is optimized for this type of work. Like we've been doing a lot of document processing work where someone hands you a stack of PDFs or a stack of documents, you turn that into a PDF. Now, previously it was the work of an analyst or someone who's going to, categorize that work to go look at it. They maybe have handed me a stack of 100 pages. And in that 100 pages, I may have 15 documents, each one with a variable length of, number of pages for each document. So like there might be someone's work to then break those things up, do data entry. Models are really good at that. You don't necessarily need a high level model to do the entire workflow. I may want to, use a high level model to do one part of it and use a lower level model to do another part of it. But that's all like custom work, right? I need to decide what my workflow is. And in those cases, it's, you make the decision based on like, how am I going to allocate my engineering dollars? Does it make sense for me to spend time optimizing this process because this process is going to cost me $2 million a year? Or does it not make sense for me to spend time optimizing this process because it's only going to cost me $5,000 a year, right? And so I think you make those decisions based on what you're looking at, what the total cost of the process is going to be, and then what kind of decision you're trying to make. Like some things it makes sense and it's easy to decide where to send it. Others, it's not.
If I step back a bit, right? So as we're having this conversation, it's technical, right? And so there's certainly a lot of sort of that knowledge and understanding of the technology, the stack that you wrap around the technology, but there's also an underlying business process that really needs to be anchored on, right? And I really like the analogy I have about onboarding an employee, right? And if I go back to whether business or contract house, whatever it is, it's understanding, well, what is it that you're actually trying to accomplish? What information do I need? What decisions do we need to take? And then how best do I do that, right? I think in the real world, right, outside of the technology, I think about, is this something that I have if I think of the organizations that a lot of people have, is you have onshore staff, you might have offshore staff, you might have, contract staff, you might have third-party folks that you bring in on an ad hoc basis. This is about, well, where do I actually put that piece of work, right? Do I have my offshore staff doing that document entry because that's at a much lower cost? Yeah. And then they prepare that for my onshore staff to do the analytics and et cetera, right? And the decision making. Yeah. So there is a huge amount of this that actually requires, as we're thinking about designing what that flow might look like with an agent, thinking about, well, what is the business actually trying to accomplish, right? And then what's the most economical, where do I get the best answer that I want coming at the end of this, handing it off to an agent? How do you help organizations lean into that from a leadership perspective, right? Because that's not just an IT question. That's not just a project manager question. That is about the leaders thinking through, well, what do I want that organization to look like? What's important for us to work on?
I think I said earlier, like the companies that are good at understanding how they need to design their business processes and have the discipline to execute that are going to do really well, because this is just a more stringent, designing of your business process. Like you need to really understand, like, what are the steps that we're going to take along the way to make this thing work. And if you are good at that, you're going to execute well because the technology is going to help you fill in what you're doing. But if you don't stop and think about that, you're going to design something that there's overlap, there's messy transitions, there's handoffs that don't happen or don't need to happen. During the 2008 crisis, there was a podcast I used to listen to. They were talking about following the business process of a local government. This was a local government that had invested in questionable securities, and they were about to, basically go bankrupt in this small town's government. And so the state sent in someone to go look at their business process. This guy went and first thing he did is all right, I'm going to go look at all the revenue. I'm going to look at all the places we're collecting fees, all the places we're collecting license fees or whatever. And so he went to the building permit office and he sees okay, I see we're taking checks. I see we're processing these and we're stamping the application and the certificate is received. We're giving back the permit. And then I'm going to go follow where that check goes. Well, where it was going was into one lady's office in shoeboxes, and she had checks from the last 15 years that have never been sent on to someone to actually deposit them in the bank. And so it was just literally just revenue sitting in this person's office because no one had ever gone and designed the process and said, once you have this, it goes to the next step, and so I think that, people who are good, companies who are good at designing those processes are going to do really well because they're going to think through where are the transitions? Where am I going to use an agent? Where is a person going to step in? How's that information going to go to the next step? And I think to answer your question about how are we helping people, I think for us to come in and be successful as a consultant in just, our work is highly technical. We're an engineering consulting firm. We do the work of building this software. But if we're going to be successful at the end of the project and the customer is going to sign off and say, yes, you guys delivered what I was expecting, we've got to understand what that process is. So we have to be good at working through the thing that they want. What do you really want as the outcome? What are you really starting with? We understand what you've told us you think the process is to get there technically, but maybe when we go through and get into this, we discover that no, maybe it's not exactly what you thought it was. Maybe it's not exactly what we thought it was. So I think you have to really dig into what's the business process? How are we going to move this stuff along? Where are we going to insert people? And then also be realistic about where are there gaps in the technology? Not everything that you think should be possible is possible right now. Maybe it is, but there's still a lot to build to get there.
I read an article, I think that you were part of a number of years ago where one of the things that stuck out of that for me was on this data journey that people have to go on, right? That process design activity, you have to have the political will to sustain it. Right. And I think that's oftentimes where I see challenges with transformational technologies coming in. A lot of excitement on the front end. Then you hit this hard work and oh boy, people start pulling back and they don't want to keep on it. How do you engage the leadership teams in these organizations to make sure they're committed and drive that, right? Because what I find oftentimes happens is you want to lean on sort of either the folks that are doing the work now, or maybe like I say, a project team to go solve and resolve all those challenges that they run into. Either the data is not connected properly, or there are process gaps that exist today that, okay, you go sort that out. Oftentimes you really need that leadership, governance, guidance, decisions to sort of clear the path, all right, that allow you then to resolve those issues that now I can bring the agent in and the agent can do what I want it to do. So how do you help them come in and understand enough about the technology, about the data, about the processes to help them make those choices?
We have a role in our organization we call the principal consultant. Usually that's the most experienced person in our organization who's responsible for the technical and business success of that project. Everyone handles it a little bit differently depending on what their background is. The way I approach it is I like to go in and be very honest about the idea that we're talking about. And if someone says, this is what I would like to accomplish, I'll think about it, look at it, try to understand what I think are the steps to get there and go, this is possible, maybe halfway what you're looking for, but here are a whole bunch of unknowns that we have to go address. Are you comfortable with this being unknown. Like, and I think the other thing people want, like one of the things we try to tell customers is like, if we're going to go, let's say, do a proof of concept, a valid result of a proof of concept is negative, right? That is a valid, you are proving out, does this work? And it's possible that the answer is it does not work. It may not be because we've done it incorrectly. It may just be because the state of what the technology or your data or your business process or, you know, our understanding of software and like all those things may line up to where this is just not possible right now. And I think you have to go in and make sure that people understand, like, this is the risk we're taking. Are you willing to take that risk? And if so, we'll help you step along the way. And I feel like that helps you build the confidence and the trust in your partners that you're going to do a good job along the way and that you're going to be honest with them about where we're at. I think the other thing to do is if I was a customer thinking about this from the other side, I would want to build in off ramps and things in my project plans or my contracts with vendors. I'd want to know, like, I'm going to try to do this. Maybe I'm not going to get there, but halfway through, I can get to something that may also be valuable for my business. And I'm just going to go, yep, we're going to get that done. And I'm not going to go to the next step because we're just not ready. The technology's just not ready. Like, we just can't get to that final end state. But I'm not locked into a contract, have not presented to my board and my leadership or my shareholders or whatever it is. I haven't gone and said, like, this is the amazing thing we're going to do. I've said, here's the process we're going to follow. We're going to see if this works. I just think we all have to agree that we're in a time where we are experimenting with this technology.
That's a truism that a lot of folks have not yet appreciated, that we're very much in an experimental stage. And what I'm hearing oftentimes, I think, is that leaders have to know enough about not just their business, but the technology side, right? One of the earlier guests I had, we talked a bit about this ownership of technologies. Should this sit with IT? Should it sit with the business? And really, it has to be a really strong marriage of the two. One of the things that I think I'm hearing from you is, as you are redesigning and really developing what this new world looks like, right? As leaders, we really have to know enough to be able to guide and converse intelligently with our teams around, well, what are those important choices you have to make, right? Go back to that frontier model versus an open source model versus, a simple model. That you have to be able to understand, well, what's the value of the choice I'm actually making, right? And we hear the stories of Uber, maxing out their AI budget in, the first a couple of months versus a year, and all these folks really spending a lot of money. I think some of that feels like it's grounded in, we really don't necessarily know what we want people to be doing with this technology, right? And I think that, for me, when I hear what you're talking about, it has to be anchored on what's the outcome we're really trying to drive towards.
I think that this is the age of the operations person, right? Like, the people who are really strong operations people in businesses, they're going to end up way ahead of their competitors. If you really understand the operations of your business and you can describe the process very well and you know the steps along the way, you're going to be successful because you're going to understand that there are things that you can accomplish that will help the next stage of your process, or that will help give information to someone that'll make a better operations decision. Not to say this isn't applicable to all, things. It's applicable to HR, it's applicable to finance, it's applicable to all of these areas. But I think what it really is coming down to is, like, do I understand the way that we are efficiently operating our business, and can I get value out of this technology?
I mean, that takes us back. I mean, just about any transformational journey that I've been on, you start with a value stream map, right? You break down, well, what is the process? And so where are the biggest opportunities for us to make a step change, right? That we really want to make an improvement in. So I think as a supply chain guy, that just resonates for me, thinking through what those process steps are and where do I bring the technology in. So I think, when we think about agents, and I think I come back to supply chain, right? A lot of times you hear the conversation is agents sort of in silos. Okay, I did an agent to go scrape this data set, or I did an agent to go scrape that data set. One of the things I reflect back on the workshop that you guys did, you're starting to talk about agents managing other agents, right? So now you have an organization of agents. We've established that even on step one for the first agent, you really have to have a good process, a mental flow of what that process is and the technologies that you can bring in. As people get more ambitious and they think about, well, now I want to have agents working with agents, what are the watchouts? What are the things that you find people falling over when they're starting to think about now pairing agents with each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think first we're still at the very beginning of that process. Like, I think where there's pretty well trod ground is, I'm going to parallelize some work by spawning additional sort of sub agents. Now that is happening in all these, harness tools for coding or cowork or, any of these things that are going to take my question, break it up into chunks and go give it to some, group of agents to go give me back the answer. I think that's pretty well-known ground. The communication of agent to agent and an agent making sort of supervisory decisions about the output of something else, especially when it comes to business process. Like, I don't think we're there yet for tools. Now, don't get me wrong, there's people experimenting with it, but I don't see a lot of those systems in production yet because of these gap in tooling and like the ontology gap and the knowledge base gap and the governance gap. Like, if I was a business right now, I don't want for something to be out there making decisions about my business and operations unless I have someone reviewing it, because I just don't know yet what it's going to do. Like, there's not enough historical, precedent and data and audit trail and all those things that you would want to see to go, all right, now I'm comfortable with like letting this thing go. And I think we've got to get there before we do that. And there's a lot of work happening there. There's discussions about, am I going to launch something that impersonates my identity? Like, is this thing going to operate in our organization as if it's me, or is it going to operate with its own identity? And if it is, how do we handle those two different situations? Like, how do I propagate permissions from if it's going to impersonate me, how do I give it permission to go access the database that I have or to make a supply chain order? If I want to place an order, create a PO and send it to a vendor, and I've somehow created an agent process to do that, and I'm giving it my identity to go make that order, one, technically, how do I do that? Two, are there thresholds that am I just going to let it create any size purchase order, or is it like a certain threshold or level? And those governance systems are just now starting to be created. And then if we're going to take the other side of that, how do I give this agent its own identity? Well, there's not a precedent for that just yet, right? There's this concept of service accounts where my application is going to go do something in another application, but I don't have yet like the concept of this thing that has its own set of things it can do that are continually evolving and growing, able to reach into my systems and do different things. Like, I need to know, like, how am I going to govern the permissions that this thing has? And I think those are also places where we're still figuring out how this works.
Right. Now, that's really interesting because, I mean, if you go to LinkedIn and you read some of the stories out there, you believe that, boy, we're at run phase, right? But it feels like you're saying we're still at crawl. Right?
Crawl,
I mean, I think crawl, walk, run.
I think we're probably in the middle. Like, I don't think we're, there are companies out there who are, like using agents on a daily basis. Do we have orchestration of those things, like, running our total business process? I don't know. I still think probably humans are largely the orchestrators there. Now there might, like, don't get me wrong, there may be like, some very cutting edge, bleeding edge organizations that are doing that, but I think they're still at the very beginning of their process as well.
We touched on a bit earlier on trust, right? I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and somebody made they were experimenting with agents, and they had an agent that could go into their emails and could help them manage their calendars. And he said they let it run. I think this goes back to some maybe like one of those Claude type things. Had on his Mac Mini, and he said, "Well, this thing started canceling my leadership team meetings." Right? I didn't mean for it to go say we're not going to have that that meeting with my chief operating officer, my CEO next week, right? Because I have something else to do. So that, I think, goes back a bit to what you just touched on in terms of that sort of having the human in the loop that's making the final calls. Well, do you really want to cancel that meeting or not? But you hear those stories and you think, oh my gosh, right? I don't want that canceling a contract with the supplier. I don't want it, going and ordering, an item because it thinks that we need it. I want to have some interception on that. So going back to sort of that trust and, explainability and human in the loop, what are your thoughts in terms of how do you make sure that's embedded as part of your process? And what are you seeing organizations sort of tripping up as they're going down this journey? Oh, you know what? These are some of the things that they're consistently forgetting to ensure that they're building in on the front end.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, again, going back to those businesses that are disciplined about process are going to be good at this.
I know you've said that a couple of times, but I find that not as many organizations that should be disciplined are.
No, we're all,
disciplined.
I mean, this is the one thing that I think this is the reason that we all are enamored by this idea is that like machines are more disciplined than we are. Like if you give it the same input 10,000 times and it's deterministic, it's going to give you exactly the same result those 10,000 times. And people are not always that way. They get tired, they get distracted, they have multiple goals. Like there's just things that those types of systems are good at. And I think that we are wanting for them to fill in our shortfalls on discipline. I think like what you were bringing up about this, like, how do we design it into the process? I think this is where the difficult part is you've got to know, like, you can ask a machine to do so much now, right? Like, but do I want it to do all that? I don't know. But now I've got to stop. This is my job now. Like it's one of our colleagues, like we were talking in the beginning of the year, like I think of that like release of Opus 4.6 as like a huge inflection moment, right? That's like, I don't know, early February this year. That model release is like completely transformed software development and how we're approaching it. We are now becoming researchers, becoming the people who are shepherding the execution of ideas. Like we're now just in the idea space as software developers. Like I've done a lot of software development over the last 6 months. I've done almost written zero lines of code. Like all of it is just interacting with models, talking about ideas, helping it to break apart the work, understanding what it's doing and the trade-offs that it's making, and then trying to steer it in the right direction. I think understanding how you're going to take a business process and decompose it and understand, like, this is where I want a person to jump in. I'm comfortable with the machine making the decision. I'm comfortable with the process helping me organize this information. Now I want a person to jump in here. Like all those things are points in the process that you've got to design and think about.
This has been really eye-opening. I think what you landed on there is a really interesting concept about how do we bring the machine into our processes. And you said a couple of things that really kind of started having me thinking around, again, as leaders and as process designers, how do we think about substituting how the machine makes a decision versus how a human being makes a decision? How do you start thinking about what's that range of choices that you allow the machine to make versus, again, going back to the process, versus the range of decisions that you have people making today? I think that starts getting a lot more into sort of the psychology and culture of an organization that you have today that allows you not necessarily to sort of predetermine, presuppose what that answer should be, but how do you think about actually creating that in the age of the agent? And that may look very different from what you have today versus the choices that you really want that sort of step in the process to be making when an agent is in there. And that, you're right, that's a complicated and very granular set of choices that people are going to have to make around, well, I only want the agent to decide in these circumstances, but I want Joe to decide under these other sets of circumstances. And that's a lot of heavy lift that I think that people are going to have to get into that they may not appreciate today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we think about this as transformation, right? Like, the Industrial Revolution was a gigantic transformational process, but think about how much infrastructure had to be built to make that work, right? Like it's warehouses and steam engines and, boilers and buildings and like, and then not only physical structures, but like societal structures as well, like neighborhoods and like the movement of people into cities, building homes for for them, roads, government, like organizations. There's just so much stuff that went into like making that thing work. It's not just going to be like we apply technology and all of a sudden everything magically happens.
Thank you for this. This has been a fascinating conversation. I think I came in thinking we'd talk a lot about technology, and we did, but we talked a lot about what has to come around it in terms of people, processes, and the technology allows you to get into what and how you actually deploy an agentic system. So thank you for grounding us back into really starting with purpose. What do you want and need this to do? And then the sustained discipline to actually go off and get it done. I'd love to carry on this conversation with you, Traey, but thank you for this. I think this has been really insightful.
Excellent. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Derek.
All right. Fantastic. Yeah. Thanks for listening to Supply Change. If today's conversation sparked questions, and it should, that's the point. Supply chain is complex, and these questions don't resolve in a single conversation. Share this podcast with someone who's navigating these decisions, and join us for the next episode as we continue exploring what it really takes to make AI work.